Hello, and welcome to Motivational Interviewing, Building a Foundation for Effective Patient Engagement. This is the introductory video for this course. The primary intention for this video is as an introduction to prepare you for a live workshop learning experience and thinking about that entire package, so both this workshop as well, this video as well as the workshop. Our objectives are that by the end, hopefully you'll feel confident identifying the 4 key domains of the spirit of motivational interviewing. We will, in the workshop format, spend a great deal of time doing some skill building and developing your skillfulness in those 4 main skills of motivational interviewing so that hopefully by the end you would feel confident using them at a basic level. We also will offer you an array of motivational interviewing strategies, and hopefully there will be at least one in that offering that you feel like you would like to take and incorporate into your day-to-day work and help you promote positive changes with the individuals you serve. And we will also, in the workshop, spend some time specifically thinking about a plan to help you continue developing in the future towards further proficiency in motivational interviewing. What we know is that one learning experience, one opportunity, whether it be a video or a live workshop, is generally not enough to help people achieve and sustain proficient practice. So we'll help you think about what next steps might make sense for you if that's something you choose and you feel like you would like to continue learning. You may just be viewing the video today as a chance to get a taste of motivational interviewing and consider whether you are interested in pursuing further learning opportunities. That's perfectly okay as well. Either way, this webinar or this video will cover both the evidence base for motivational interviewing, so some of the just what the research tells us and what some of the research is around motivational interviewing. We're also going to talk about the worldview in motivational interviewing, so sort of just our approach to change and the people we serve and our view of our role in that process. And then we'll also look at the spirit of motivational interviewing, or the style, and that is generally just our way of being when we're doing motivational interviewing. So a little bit about me. My name is Mia Croyle, and I have been using motivational interviewing since around 2007. I've had the opportunity to use it in phone coaching, in primary care settings, and also in group settings with a variety of different individuals facing various clinical concerns and ranging in age from, really preteen all the way through our older adult population. I've been helping people think about learning motivational interviewing and doing some coaching since about 2009. I've had the opportunity to work with people across the U.S. in healthcare, social service, as well as criminal justice and early childhood populations. And I've been a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers since about 2011, and that is an organization of individuals sort of devoted to promoting best practices around helping people learn and acquire skills in motivational interviewing. So I'm glad to get the chance to give you this brief introduction to motivational interviewing. And before we go too deeply into it, I think it's important that we all are working from a common definition, because sometimes the name of motivational interviewing doesn't exactly accurately portray what it is. So motivational interviewing is, one definition is that it's a collaborative, person-centered guiding method specifically designed to elicit and strengthen motivation for change. So there's a lot of jargon packed in there, but some of our main key concepts are also considered in there or included in there. Motivational interviewing is collaborative, which means it's something we do with people and not to them. It's really very focused on the other person, and we use it when we're asking the person to consider a change or a behavior that might be new or different for them. And we use it specifically to draw out and help further develop their own arguments around their own motivation for change. So another way of defining it, sort of the shorter version, is it's a way of structuring our conversations when we're trying to help the other person talk themselves into making the change. So we help them think about, what are their own arguments for this change or this behavior? From their own point of view, why might this make sense? That is a bit of a departure from our traditional approaches in healthcare and in the helping professions, where we often find ourselves in the position of us making our own arguments for the other person to make a change. And in motivational interviewing, we say that, whoa, before we ever get into the position of us making those arguments, we really want to help the other person flesh out their own arguments. And then maybe we'll supplement those with some additional information. So we say that motivational interviewing is a guiding approach. It uses a guiding style. So if you think about a continuum where at one end is directing, and that is, like it sounds, it's very much about us, very much about what we want or think the other person should do. So involved in direction is a lot of just kind of telling the other person this is what they should do, this is how they should do it, this is when they should do it, etc. And there are certainly approaches or instances in healthcare where a directing approach is very appropriate and very necessary. Generally what we find is that when a person is facing a change that presents some challenge to them, just directing isn't necessarily the most long-term, durable, effective, and empowering approach. At the other end of our continuum is following, and that might be where we really let the other person be totally in control. So we're just in that listening space, we're trying to be supportive of them, and really they're driving the boat, not just in terms of the changes, but in terms of the conversation, in terms of our interaction, etc. There might be times when that is very useful of an approach, in our helping and healthcare setting. And then in the middle space, between those two, is our guiding approach, where what the other person wants to say and how they want to structure our time is important and informs things, but also what we think is going to be most useful also informs our interaction. So again, if you think about over the directing pole, or sort of that end of the continuum, it's my agenda. And if you look at the following pole as being about the other person's agenda, the guiding space is where both of those are really contributing to our time together and to our interaction. And when we talk about learning motivational interviewing or doing motivational interviewing, there are two main sort of categories of what we have to learn and be able to do. There's the relational aspects, and that really talks about how we're able to connect with the other person, how we work with them. And there's the technical aspects, and that looks at our skills and our strategies and the various techniques that we might use in motivational interviewing. Now, there are things about our skills and our strategies and our techniques that are not unique to motivational interviewing. They might show up in other approaches. They might be things you're already doing or things you've already learned. And the same is true about the relational aspects. There are things that in our spirit or our way of being, our style in motivational interviewing that aren't unique to motivational interviewing. They show up in a lot of other approaches as well. And where we really say that it truly looks like motivational interviewing is where the two of those overlap. And so I think that is what makes some of these things a little more distinctive. If you're just doing the techniques without that relational foundation, we sometimes say it might be like having the words to a song without the music, or, it starts to feel a little gimmicky and techniquey. And that does present a bit of a challenge for people first learning motivational interviewing, because the easiest things to pick up and start applying, the most tangible pieces of it, are the technical aspects. So it's very easy to take one skill of motivational interviewing or one particular strategy or technique and put it into practice. It's much harder to put into practice some of those relational aspects. But we're going to focus a good deal in this video on those relational aspects, because they really are important in terms of competent practice and proficient practice of MI. So looking for sort of reliable sources of what is MI and what does it look like and what might it seem, or how might we sort of unpack the more theoretical aspects of motivational interviewing. The book, Motivational Interviewing, Helping People Change, tends to be the main source, and it's authored by our two original architects of motivational interviewing, William Miller and Stephen Rolnick. This book was first published in 1991, and then we had a second edition, and now we're on the third edition, which came out in about 2013, so it's still relatively new. And included in that third edition, which was really came out about 30 years after MI first emerged, we have the learnings from over 25,000 articles that cite motivational interviewing and over 200 randomized control trials, which are generally considered the gold standard for evidence-based and research in our science and research fields. And what we see in this book is some significant changes. So some additions, some things that were stated one way in the previous editions have now been updated to reflect our latest learnings and our best, most up-to-date knowledge on motivational interviewing and what can be effective and what, how we can best support it and spread it and use it with the people we serve. So if you learned or were exposed to motivational interviewing sort of prior to somewhere in the space of 2013-ish, there may be some things in updated motivational interviewing learning that seem new or different to you. Thinking about the research in motivational interviewing, like I said, there's a very robust evidence base behind motivational interviewing. It's not just something that somebody's thought sounded like a good idea. It has been extensively studied. And if we look, this graph, it looks a little bit busy, but it shows us a couple things to look at, both the history and the development of motivational interviewing, as well as tells us a little bit about the studies that we've seen as they have emerged. So that first bar, if you look all the way to the right-hand side of your screen, that first bar that's labeled 1988 to 94, that shows us that the first published research in that time frame, there were 6 studies. And if you look at the sort of red, go over to the other side of your screen where the key is to tell us, those first studies were all in the field of alcohol and other drug treatment. And then moving on further to the right to that second bar, you see quite quickly in the next set of time that we started seeing, number one, exponential growth in the number of studies, and we also start seeing pretty quickly people were looking at applying motivational interviewing beyond just alcohol and drug treatment. That's where it started, but that's certainly not where it stayed, and not where it only lives these days, for sure. But we started seeing in that first time frame of 95 to 99, we started seeing people looking at and studying its application in dual diagnosis situations, problem gambling, offenders, which talks about our criminal justice population, eating disorders, treatment adherence and retention, smoking and tobacco, HIV, STD risk, cardiac diabetes, and so on and so on. It goes quite far up the list in that very first time frame after the first studies came out. And as you continue toward the right and look at the subsequent bars, you see continued growth in the number of studies and continued sort of variety in the fields that are being studied, or the populations and clinical conditions that are being studied in terms of the applications of motivational interviewing. Now, this particular graph ends at 2009. If we saw the next bar, you would see that we're now well over 200 studies in motivational interviewing, looking at different applications of it, and the number of different fields where it's being applied continues to grow. I'm always impressed by some of the creative applications of motivational interviewing. Generally, if you say, hey, has motivational interviewing been looked at for use in this clinical situation or with this population, generally, if you do a little digging, you'll find that, yes, someone has looked at that or written about that. So a lot of research has been done. Yay, research. But for me, I'm more concerned with sort of the bottom line. What do we know? What does the research tell us? And based on that research, what can we say with reasonable confidence? So we can say that generally we find that motivational interviewing improves retention, adherence, and outcomes across a wide range of behaviors. We also can say that it tends to generalize fairly well across cultures. Motivational interviewing is not just something used here in the U.S. or with our sort of European counterparts. It is being applied internationally around the globe and that has been translated into many different languages, is being used in many different languages across Asia, Africa, certainly widely throughout Europe, and the Middle East has had some exposure to motivational interviewing. We're seeing some spread on the African continent. Certainly it's been used quite a bit in South Africa, but it's also being used beyond that. So we're seeing really worldwide adoption of some MI practices. The other thing we know from the research is that relationships matter. Our ability to connect and form a positive working relationship with the other person really impacts our outcomes. And this is not true of just motivational interviewing. We find this is true in almost every approach that we study. What I think is unique in motivational interviewing is that it gives you some particular tools and skills to really establish that positive working relationship. And that's true whether it's sort of a regularly scheduled, longer visit. You know, maybe you are a care manager and you're working with someone and you're going to get the opportunity to call them once a week or every other week or once a month and have, you know, a good long chat with them over a sustained period of time. Or it may be that you have a brief visit with the person and that's it. One of the applications of motivational interviewing that has been there since the beginning has been in sort of that context of brief intervention, where maybe you're meeting with them 7, 15, 20 minutes, and that may be the only time you see them. You may have a follow-up visit, but either way, our ability to connect with them in a positive relationship really can impact outcomes. We also know that change talk and sustained talk and discord, and those all really look at what the other person is saying or doing in the interaction and how we're influencing that. We know that those things really matter. They impact outcomes. They're linked to better or worse outcomes, and to a large degree, they're in our control. There are things we can reliably do to promote one or the other happening more or less in our interactions. We also know that motivational interviewing is learnable. So it's not just something you either are born naturally inclined to do or not. There's emerging a great deal of research about how people best learn and develop their skillfulness in motivational interviewing. And we know that we can reliably measure proficiency, so how accurately someone is doing what we say the main components of motivational interviewing are. And higher levels of measured proficiency predict better outcomes. So this is something that really, the evidence seems pretty clear. If we devote our energy and our efforts on improving our practice in motivational interviewing, it's going to have beneficial outcome to the people we serve. So absolute bottom line, sort of, does MI work? In 2010, there was a meta-analysis done that looked at a wide number of studies in lots of different circumstances and looked to answer this question. And what they found is that about 75% of individuals in an MI condition did improve. So, yes, MI, generally, we would say it works. It's not a magic wand. It doesn't work for everyone. This isn't going to be the thing that sort of you can just do a little MI and all your patients and clients that you work with all of a sudden will be making all the positive changes we hope they would. But we do know that about 75% of the time, MI has a positive impact on the interaction and the outcomes. Now, about 50% of that was very modest, but still statistically significant improvement. And about 25% of that was much more robust improvement, also in the statistically significant area. So we know that for some people, those changes are going to look pretty dramatic. And for the majority of people, they're going to be small incremental changes that help them move forward in a positive direction toward the changes we're working to promote. So at sort of our highest level, what we're aiming to do in motivational interviewing is promote positive change. And sort of some of our more near-term goals, so what am I trying to accomplish in any interaction? One is we work to reduce resistance, and we do that by both strategically setting up our relationships in ways that are least likely to invite that resistance to come and join us in our interactions, and by having an arsenal of tools and skills at our disposal so that when the resistance shows up, when there might be some discord in our relationship, or when the person is really pushing back based on something we did or something else going on, we can really work to just resolve that resistance quickly. We also work in motivational interviewing pretty intentionally to address ambivalence. So ambivalence talks about that situation where people feel pulled in both directions. Generally, people who are stuck in the process of making positive changes have some level of ambivalence. So if they haven't already changed, there tends to be ambivalence present. It's important to remember there are lots of people who can and do make positive changes all the time without any professional intervention at all whatsoever. Those are people who usually are capable of resolving their own ambivalence. The people who get a little more stuck tend to get stuck in that ambivalence. So ambivalence is just the condition of having arguments both for and against the change, both of which feel important and significant to you. So we think about an individual considering the change of quitting smoking, right? On one side of the equation, we would call this their change talk. They might have arguments surrounding better health. They might know, they likely are pretty aware of some of the negative impacts on their health. They might be feeling it. They might have some hopes and goals for better health and feeling better, right? They might also have some arguments for making a change in the financial area, right? They might know that cigarettes are more and more expensive every year, and they don't like the amount of their income that they're spending on it. They certainly would have better things they'd like to be doing with their money. So, they've got some things on the change talk side of the equation. Generally, people who haven't yet decided to quit and aren't working on that yet also have some arguments on the other side of the equation, which we call the sustain talk side. So those are their arguments for not making a change. Possibly they've tried to quit before and really struggled with it or not, and obviously not been able to sustain that successful quit. Often people might have concerns about weight gain or moodiness or discomfort when they quit smoking. And so those things might represent their sustain talk or their arguments against the change. And so what we want to be able to do is help people sort of take stock of that equation and ultimately help them build up the side of the argument for the change so that it feels important enough for them that they can consider some strategies to reduce the impact of the sustain side of the change and move forward into that change. So if we think about it like a teeter-totter, we want to help the change talk side of that teeter-totter get heavier and heavier until it's just, momentum and gravity takes it down, and that's the side that they've decided. We also work in motivational interviewing to raise discrepancy for people. So discrepancy is that difference between the way things are and the way things ideally would be, the way they'd like things to be. And in that difference, in the distance between those two things, there often is a bit of discomfort. And so our role is to really be comfortable holding the space and supporting the individual while they experience some of that discomfort, because generally in that discomfort lies the motivation for change. And so we want to work on increasing that, not so far and so fast that we freak people out, but helping people, gradually explore some of that discomfort and think about making some positive changes to resolve it. And then we really intentionally and strategically work throughout our interaction to elicit change talk from the individual. So change talk, again, is that person's own arguments for making a change. And it's important that those arguments come from the other person and not from us, which is somewhat a bit of a change from our approach in most health professions and helping professions. But we do want to help people give voice to their own arguments of making a change. When we think about readiness, right, readiness is a big factor in successfully making a change or not. And two of the main components of readiness are importance and confidence. Okay? So if someone isn't able to identify why a change might be important to them, if they can't give you some reasons why that change would be beneficial, it's unlikely that they're going to put forth any effort toward the change. And if the person does not have high confidence that they would successfully be able to make that change, again, they're less likely to put forth any effort toward making the change. So we want to help increase both people's importance and their confidence because both of those contribute to readiness. There might be other factors that interfere with readiness, such as resources, which could tie into confidence, and also priorities, which might tie into importance. So they might be able to tell you, yes, making a change is important and here's the reasons why, but I have other things that are more important that are competing for my time and attention and energy, and so helping people sort of work through that. But being able to recognize high importance and high confidence or low importance or low confidence and being able to, successfully help people increase their levels of one or the other or both. So when we think about our approach or sort of our worldview in motivational interviewing, we want to think about what does it typically look like in our helping professions in healthcare when we're working with someone facing a challenge or a change, and particularly when we're working with someone who has not yet made a change that we think they really should. Okay? So often we've been trained to try to sort of put on our detective hat and figure out what the problem is. Okay? So we would ask, if this person isn't making the change, why not? What's the matter? And so often we'll make some assumptions about what that, why that change hasn't happened yet. Maybe they don't know that they're supposed to make the change. Maybe they don't really understand the situation. Perhaps they don't know how to make the change. Maybe they just don't care about their health and their well-being. Or maybe we like to say people are in denial. Maybe they're in denial about the need to make the change. And so if that's the case, then we view our role based on those assumptions to either educate them, teach them, inform them, oftentimes to persuade them, we got to twist their arm and convince them to make this change, or provide things that are missing, resources, guidance, recommendations. And what we find is that although there's nothing wrong with any of those tasks in and of themselves, those aren't necessarily the things that get people stuck. What we end up doing when we utilize this deficit approach is really disempowering our patients. We're teaching them that whatever's missing, we're the supplier of it. And we're teaching them to be dependent on us and come back to us to supply what's missing. So our metaphor for this deficit approach is, if they're a glass half empty, we're the faucet. And we're working really hard to sort of fill up what's missing. And if that were successful, I would be on a video telling you, do more of that. But what we know is that for a lot of people, that isn't the thing that successfully helps them make a change. The message we send people when we do that is that there's something wrong with them. There's something lacking in them. And so I don't know if any of you have had this experience, but I certainly have, where I've tried to be the faucet, and I'm pouring and pouring and pouring, and gosh, it feels like I am working so much harder than the other person. And no matter what I pour in, their glass doesn't fill up. So then I'm like, gosh, there must be a hole in the bottom or something. Or maybe in their encounter with me, the glass gets filled up, but then they go out in the world, and the next time they come back, it's empty again, or half empty again. And I think, well, what are they doing? Just spilling all this water everywhere? I'm trying to help them. And it can be a very frustrating cycle to get in. So in motivational interviewing, we encourage people to try a different approach. So we call this the competence approach. It's very aligned with our other strengths-based approaches that you may be familiar with. But when looking at someone who has a change that they maybe haven't made or need to make, we look first at what matters to that person. What are their strengths? What are their values? What resources can they bring to bear? What experiences have they had that can inform their efforts? What's their perspective on this whole situation? And so then that, again, informs our role. We're there to listen. We try to understand them and maybe reflect some of that understanding back and help them grow their own self-understanding. We're there to notice and share with them our perception of themes that we're hearing. And ask good questions. It doesn't mean that we don't, from a competence approach, also at a certain point have the opportunity to educate or inform or link to resources, but what it does mean is that we're not using that as our first approach to try and motivate people. People generally don't change based on information, at least not these complex changes that really get us kind of feeling frustrated and looking for new resources and new approaches to help people make change. What we find is that people change because of their values. People change because things feel important to them. And so we want to get in touch with that first and foremost. When they feel ready, they may identify, or together in partnership, we may identify that there's some education or some resources that could also be useful. And we can offer those when we're sure that the person is ready to receive them. And so in motivational interviewing, we just encourage you to start at a different place. And so we're trying to start from a place of competence. And that informs our worldview. So we assume and we trust that people are competent, that they have knowledge, attitudes, capabilities, know-how, perspectives that can be positive and can affect change. And then that tells us that our main focus is on being present with them in a way that's going to support that change and support that confidence. So when we look at the spirit of MI, which sometimes can be called the style of MI, but more often it just goes by the spirit of MI, there's four main components: partnership, evocation, acceptance, and compassion. We're going to go over each of those four in just a little more detail. So partnership really talks about how are you connecting with the other person? How are you establishing this positive working relationship? So I'm not able to be there in the room with you as you watch this video, but here's a little way that pieces of my life are together. Here's some pictures from my own life. The picture on the right is me dancing with my dad at my wedding, and we say that motivational interviewing should feel like dancing with the other person. Right? We're both moving together. Maybe one of us is taking the lead at some times, and another one of us might be taking the lead at a different time, but we're both in this together, and we're both moving, and we both have a willingness to engage. Versus the other picture, the purple picture, is my son in the purple, doing a little bit of wrestling, right? So sometimes our encounters feel like grappling for control and, trying to wrestle our way into a change. And so what we say in MI is a good sort of gut sense way to keep track of how you're doing on partnership. Does it feel more like you're dancing with the other person, or does it feel like you're wrestling? And we want to be dancing, not wrestling. Our second main component of the spirit of motivational interviewing is evocation. And that's just a fancy way of saying drawing the other person out. So we want to really be doing a lot more listening, a lot more strategic asking, to hear from the other person about their perspective, about their priorities, about their values, about their ideas, And we want to be doing that first and foremost versus going in with sort of a set agenda and a checklist of things we want to do and say and get done. So in Evocation, we want to be in more of that listening, drawing out space. Our third component of the spirit of motivational interviewing is acceptance. And that really talks about how we want to, at every juncture, be enhancing the person's perception of choice and control. Often that starts with reminding ourselves that what, if anything, the other person does about any of the changes we're discussing is ultimately up to them. This is one of those things where often when I'm first talking with people about motivational interviewing, they sort of nod their head and it's like, yeah, of course it's in their control. But when we look at what people actually do and how they behave, often in healthcare we behave as if people don't have a choice. They have to make these changes. They have to do what's prescribed for them to do. And what we find is that people generally don't like to be told what to do. Having health conditions or health concerns can often be a very vulnerable space, so people are already feeling like their choices and their sense of control is being narrowed just by the fact that they're there talking to a professional about something in their life, right? And often those things are big, challenging things like a chronic condition or an acute situation that needs to get resolved. And so what we want to do is continue to keep our focus on, first of all, behaving as if they're in control and reminding and reinforcing and enhancing their perception of control throughout our interaction and control over their situation. So helping them realize where they have choices and making sure that they're making active and informed choices. So we work on acceptance. And then the last element of our spirit of motivational interviewing is compassion. And this is one, I mentioned that in the newest edition of the Motivational Interviewing book, we've had some changes. This was added into our spirit of motivational interviewing as a fourth element. And really, it was intentionally added because as we've seen more and more research and more awareness emerge about the power of motivational interviewing, we've seen some applications of it where maybe it hasn't been being used per se in the best interest of the other person. So an example of that is sales. Right? So that's not necessarily using motivational interviewing in the best interest of the other person. So the authors really kind of came down firmly and planted a stake in the ground saying, if it's not done with compassion, it's really not within the spirit of motivational interviewing. And then not explicitly named as an element of the spirit of motivational interviewing, but a very clear thread that runs through all of that is empathy. And empathy defined as, our efforts to understand the other person's perspective, try on that perspective and get in touch with it, both on a cognitive and an emotional level. Empathy is not pity or feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is not having had the same experiences as them or having sympathy for them. Empathy is just really working to understand what this situation looks like from their point of view. As we think about what a motivational interviewing encounter might look like, there are four main processes that we work on: engaging, focusing, evoking, and planning. And those four are somewhat linear. Generally, we start at that bottom step of engaging and move upward in a logical progression. And yet, sometimes we need to go back and revisit a previous step. And we know that even when we're standing on that top step of planning, we're still standing solidly on our steps of evoking, focusing, and engaging. So thinking about engaging is generally our first task, and it's where we establish that collaborative working relationship with the other person. It's been proposed that we spend about 20 minutes of our initial time up front focusing primarily on engaging. That doesn't mean chit-chat or just, off-topic chatter, but it's where we're really attending to listening and hearing the other person, finding out what's important to them, and paying attention to how effective we're working together in a collaborative way. Our next step, or our next process, is often focusing. And so that's where we develop and maintain a specific agenda. We discover what's important to the other person, maybe find out what they think they should be focusing on. And often this is an unfolding and evolving process. If we think about, a lot of the things that we work with people on, there are lots of discrete behaviors that could be an area of focus. So, for example, in the context of diabetes self-care, right, we ask people to take medication. We might ask them to also dose themselves with insulin. We ask them to test their blood sugar, maybe record it somewhere. We're asking them to make dietary changes, possibly even, count sugars and carbs. We're asking them often to make some changes in their physical activity level. And we might be asking them to, schedule lots of other follow-up visits with other providers as well. Maybe we're asking them to go get their annual eye exam, those types of things. So thinking about all of those discrete behaviors, any one of those could be our area of focus. But we have to sort of, together with the other person, figure out what are we talking about. And then once we've got that agenda in hand, then we move on to evoking. If you're not getting to the process of evoking, it's really not yet motivational interviewing. So just engaging and focusing, if I just do that, it's not yet motivational interviewing, but it becomes motivational interviewing when we're evoking. And what are we working to evoke? Change talk. So that's where we're really using our strategies and our tools and our skills to help the person sort of make their own case for the change. And again, change talk is just anything that they say that favors movement towards a change. It might be some discussion of what they don't like about the way things are now. It might be some discussion about what they wish would be present in the future, what they hope for, what they're moving toward. All of that is change talk. The main important criteria is that it's the other person's own arguments for change, not ours. And then the last process of our 4 is planning. You don't need to get to planning for it to be motivational interviewing. And sometimes, based on the individual's readiness, it's not appropriate to get to planning yet. So we might end a session without a plan in place. Generally, we know that people tend to be more successful in making behavior changes if they have some concrete steps and plans and things to do coming out of an encounter with us. And we also know that if we prematurely move to planning before the person is ready, what we're likely to do is push them further back away from the change, because they will feel as if they're being told to do something and, they just don't have the same level of ownership and engagement with the change process. If they aren't ready, you'll find that once people have a readiness and their motivation intact, the planning process happens quite easily. However, it's very tempting as a health professional to tie things up in a nice, neat bow at the end, and often what that looks like, that nice, concrete, solid ending, often for us looks like a plan. So we want them to walk out with a plan, and a plan of some concrete action steps. sometimes the best plan to leave people with might be to think about this some more, or to gather some more information from various places in their life, whether that's noticing things or talking to people, right? But it may not be an action plan of, okay, I'm going to embark on this change right away. We might give them some sort of a mini plan to help them get ready for more of a plan. So that is where we're going to end this video. If you are watching this video in preparation of joining us for a live face-to-face workshop, we will start with reviewing some of this content and then hopefully get a running head start into some hands-on skill building and some MI strategies so that we can make best use of our valuable face-to-face time. If you're viewing this as a standalone, at this point, you probably, if you want to take a next step, a good next step would be to find some opportunities to learn more about the technical aspects of motivational interviewing. We've introduced you pretty solidly to some of the relational aspects, but we haven't yet gotten to what our skills are, what we're actually doing in motivational interviewing, and what some of those skills and strategies look like. So some potential next steps for you might be to find a workshop or find some additional online learning, if that's something you choose to continue on with. You have my contact information if you want to go on a deeper dive in any of the topics that we talked about here, particularly the research, but any of the other areas as well. Please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm happy to connect with people via email and point them in the direction of some solid, well-vetted resources. Thank you for dedicating some of your very, very valuable time to this introduction to motivational interviewing.